Crossing state lines has always been easy, but today we're diving into why you might want to think twice before going over state lines if you're packing your six-shooter. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number, the podcast where we take a look at legislation that sounds simple and uncover why it is anything but. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Stephen, and today's episode starts with a question that sounds almost too reasonable. If you can legally carry a concealed firearm in one state, should that right follow you into another?
It's one of those questions where you hear it and you think, well, maybe? And then 5 minutes later, you're nose deep in constitutional law, federalism, public safety debates, and fighting for air.
Exactly. And this has to do with a very common phrase that we hear all the time on Beyond the Bill Number, states' rights.
Ah, yes, one of our favorite catchphrases here, along with preemption.
Absolutely. Preemption, state rights. What's the Supreme Court been up to? So gun laws, obviously something that as a European I find deeply weird and strange and also quite scary. So one of the reasons why I think people can be very nervous about visiting the United States from Europe is that we think that everybody's wandering around carrying sort of high-powered weaponry on a hair trigger to use it at any time, which obviously is not necessarily true, but it can be. So obviously within the EU, very different laws about firearms, but generally quite highly regulated, and you certainly cannot cross from one country to another just carrying a gun. So if you do, for some reason, manage to get a firearm to have a gun, like, I don't know, maybe you're in the Olympic shooting team or something, then the actual laws around how it should be packed and how you have to transport it and all the paperwork is obviously a complete nightmare. So the idea you can just wander around carrying a gun, and particularly from state to state within the United States, obviously very, very strange in Europe.
Yeah, I remember, so my husband is a Texan and his dad is like a very into Texas historian. One of my husband's middle names is Austin, after the founder of Texas, like
Okay,
big Texan
right.
family. And apparently my husband's dad would wear a gun on his hip. He'd just wear a gun and he'd go into a coffee shop. You know, it was just a little gun. So the stuff going on here in the States is very different culturally state to state, as well as with the politics and the legislation within those states with guns. So usually you can see a lot of more lenient gun laws leaning to states that have more lenient ideas of carrying guns and possessing them.
Yes.
But it is quite interesting. And one of the questions I had was about the EU. And do you all have kind of similar border to border laws? I know guns is something very different, but just in general, is there laws that change severely, like if you pass over a border, or is it kind of all generally the same vibe?
Well, no, that's the whole purpose of the EU, that it was founded to do. One of the central pillars is free movement of people, goods and services. And so to do that, you need to have regulatory harmonization. So all the EU member states have to comply with exactly the same regulations. And actually, it was one of the big reasons that certain people in the UK objected to this, because they're effectively saying, you don't get to make your own laws. We just have to follow what Brussels says. And obviously you're part of that. The process in making those laws, but that was it. So, and over decades, they raised all this anger, and they had all these stupid, non-existent examples of how this was terrible, about how the EU had all these massive red tape about how bendy a banana was allowed to be, and all of this kind of stuff. None of this was true, but it just became this huge thing that you're swamped with red tape because you all have to comply. Actually, of course, the fact that all of these EU member states have exactly the same regulations eliminates a huge amount of red tape, because it means there's no checks when you go over borders. You just, if you're in the EU, you just drive through that border. It's like moving between states in the United States, and that was what it was meant to be.
And it's interesting in the States with how different the laws can be within the States, especially with things like gun ownership, traveling with a gun in your car, that we don't have any type of border control between states if there are such huge discrepancies in these types of bills and regulations, if you literally go from, let's say, Colorado into Wyoming. So I think today, let's get into it, because it's pretty interesting. And this is something I think I looked into a few years ago, and it's, like everything here, coming back around. So today we're talking about H.R. 38, or the Constitutional Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act of 2025. And this bill is doing a lot more than that very intense title suggests.
Yes, that is a mouthful. I'm glad you had to say it and I didn't. And if you do want to follow this bill, we should say, or in fact, any federal or state legislation, it's a perfect moment to give a shout out to Bill Track 50. You can track HR 38 from committee to calendar to floor action all in one place without needing a law degree or 5 different browser tabs open.
Emphasis on that law degree. Okay, so Stephen, let's break this down. What does HR 38 actually do? It's not really a slogan version, but the legislative reality here.
Yes, it's a great distinction there between what does it actually do versus what people say it does. The slogan version is about reciprocity, but the legislative version is actually much broader than that. So under HR 38, a person could carry a concealed handgun across state lines if they, one, are not prohibited under federal law from possessing a firearm, two, have a valid photo ID, and three, either have a concealed carry permit or are allowed to carry it in their home state by the laws within that state.
Okay, and that last part feels very important.
Yes, it is very, very important, really, because it means that the bill doesn't just apply to permit holders, it also applies to people from states with permitless carry. So it means you don't necessarily have to have that permit when you're traveling around the country.
And the plot thickens. So this isn't just state A recognizes state B's permit, it's a lot bigger than that.
Yes, it's much, much bigger. So the bill also limits when law enforcement can detain or arrest somebody over firearm possession, creates legal remedies if somebody's rights are violated under the Act, and exempts qualified individuals from certain federal restrictions, including parts of the Gun-Free School Zones Act.
That is an interesting take there. So this is less like a handshake agreement between states and more like a federal rule book.
Yes, exactly. It sets a national baseline, and in doing so, it overrides some of those state level decisions.
Okay, so in theory, you can see how this is a huge problem. One, it's hard to know what every single state is up to. Two, if you're carrying a gun, it's hard to know if you're going from being completely not even going to be questioned, no problems at all, to, spending life in prison because you have a gun with you or something like that. Who knows? Let's talk about why supporters say this needed.
Yep. Well, the problem is a very familiar one to, again, something we talk about a lot. The fact that the current system is a patchwork. Of course it is, 50 different states. So some states recognize out-of-state permits. Some recognize only some other states out-of-state permits. Some recognize none of them at all. So a person can legally carry in one state, cross a border, and suddenly they're in violation of the law. So unless you're really up on all of the different laws of all of the different states, if you're traveling around a lot, it can be a complete nightmare.
It sounds like a nightmare, and it sounds like our patchwork nation.
Yes, indeed, it is. It is this patchwork nation again. But supporters do argue then that a constitutional right shouldn't disappear just because you cross state lines. And this is the really crucial argument here. It's all about those constitutional rights. And it's the fact that individual states are putting barriers in place. Is that violating someone's constitutional rights?
Yeah, so supporters are essentially saying rights should travel.
Yes, exactly. The Second Amendment is a nationwide Second Amendment. The Constitution is nationwide. So it should function like any other constitutional right, and it should be consistent across states. And they also emphasize, of course, that this applies only to lawful carriers, that states can still restrict firearms in certain locations, and that private property rights do remain intact.
Okay, so from that perspective, this is about consistency, not deregulation.
Yes, exactly. And that's how supporters frame it. A federal floor for a constitutional right, which seems perfectly reasonable.
It does seem that way, doesn't it? But let's flip it on its head, because
Absolutely.
I'm sure that there are opponents and they might see things a little differently.
Yes, they do, of course. And obviously, anything to do with guns really is extremely polemic and gets blood pressure rising. So the arguments of people opposed to this focus on states' rights and public safety. So they say that this bill would override state laws, and it would force the stricter states to effectively accept looser standards from those other states. And it would undermine local control over who is allowed to carry concealed weapons.
Right, and concealed carried weapons are a huge thing that is part of this, that are no small task to really analyze and think about what is the right way that we just allow people to be walking around with guns in public. Instead of reciprocity, a lot of opponents see this as more of a mandate.
Yes, it is. And it is really important here because people in a particular state vote for a particular law and they say, we don't, as you say, we don't want to see guns on the street. We don't want to see people wandering in front of schools carrying guns. You know, we don't consider that safe. So why then, because somebody's come from the next state over, they should be allowed to do that. You'd no longer be able to be confident that you haven't got people walking around with guns in a way that actually the electorate of that particular state has decided they don't want to see it. So it's a very strong argument here. And the key issue is, of course, about the wildly different standards that you get from states to states. So some require permits, training, background checks. So you might say, okay, well, we're pretty confident that anyone carrying a gun in our state is not a psychopath because we've got all of these checks. They know how to use the gun. Whereas others, of course, they just allow permitless carry, and you've got no idea whether the person knows what they're doing, whether they're going to be drunk, whether they are going to be sort of, have some sort of mental health issues. So under HR 38, then, those stricter states would effectively have to accept the looser standards of those other states.
Okay, so the word reciprocity might be doing some, let's say, heavy lifting here.
Yes, that's a very polite way to put it. So traditionally then, reciprocity implies mutual agreement, but that's not how it's working here, because it's not like California can turn around to Texas and say, okay, so we have really strict laws, so therefore we want you to also have strict laws when people travel to your state. No, that's not how it works. Here, it's much more like one state sets these looser rules like Texas, another state like California then has to accept them.
Yeah, it's less you recognize mine, I'll recognize yours, and more everyone gets to recognize maybe the worst behaved kid in class just gets to do what they want to do because we can't figure out a way to control them.
Yes, absolutely. And that is the criticism in a nutshell. You might say like a race to the bottom type argument.
Yes. Okay, so let's talk about the research side here, because this is where things get complicated if they weren't already.
Yes, it is. So it comes back to all of the research that's been done around gun ownership and gun use. And there's actually very limited direct research on nationwide reciprocity because, of course, there isn't any. But there is research on concealed carry laws more broadly. And there are findings that suggest that a shall issue law, which is basically where authorities are required to issue permits to people who meet criteria, they don't really have much discretion there, that they may be associated with increases in certain type of crime. The evidence on permitless carry is mixed as to whether it makes things more dangerous or not.
Okay, so kind of definitive, but kind of not, and it's not irrelevant, but it's not really a guiding force.
No. So on the public safety one, it's difficult to make a very definitive argument that this law would decrease public safety across the board. But on the other hand, it's certainly not increasing it, is it? So there is argument on both sides. But it does add a little bit of weight to concerns, even if it's not actually settled in that debate.
All right. So one of the most important parts of this debate is that some opposition is coming from law enforcement?
Yes. And it's a bit of a zinger, really, because obviously people who favour gun ownership and support sort of the constitutional right to carry guns and so on, they will tend to be very supportive of police and expect that support from the police. But groups like national police organisations have actually warned that this law could be a complete nightmare for the police. Because if you think about it, a police officer in a particular state would have to be able to interpret laws from all of the 50 states, keeping up to date with them as they change. They would then have to make real-time decisions during traffic stops, and they'd have to navigate new limits on detention and enforcement. And remember, the bill does include that right to basically get redress if your constitutional rights are violated in any way in exactly this sort of situation.
So instead of the rest of us being responsible for our own gun ownership and being our own constitutional law professors, now the police need to do it and make very in the moment decisions about what could be too far, not far, what's allowed, not allowed.
Absolutely.
That seems
exactly.
Like
so maybe in every police car you'd have obviously your police officers, but then you'd also have a constitutional law professor there just in case, somebody who can actually interpret all of this for them.
Or it could be your constitutional carry AI bot. Ask all the questions to them, and then they can give you a green, a yellow, or a red. Okay, so while this bill simplifies things for carriers, it really does complicate things for officers. And when you think about what this actually does look like in practice, it kind of seems like it makes things easier. But then again, when you go beyond that bill number and that one little title, it's kind of like,
Yes, exactly. And it's a big concern. And when the police are worried about things, then that does carry a lot of weight in these kind of debates.
Yes. So let's talk legislative status, because this one is still very much alive.
Yes, it is. So HR 38, it's cleared the Judiciary Committee and it's been placed on the union calendar. So that means that it's eligible for House floor consideration. So it's still very early stages for the bill.
Okay. And the Senate is a tougher path, right?
Yes. Historically, this would be a problem. And bills like this will often face much higher hurdles there. So, I mean, let's be honest, the chances of this bill becoming law the chances of a lot of congressional bills becoming law, which is very, very slim.
Right. So let's zoom out. At its core, HR 38 is about who gets the final say. Is it the federal government defining a national right, or is it the individual states who can set their own rules?
Yes, that's right. So it's not just about guns. It's about federalism. So it's a classic tension between national standards and state autonomy.
It's very interesting to see this framed with guns when there has been so much discussion about these types of rules with abortion. And I feel like these two sides are in opposition for each other.
Yes.
So I'll be interested to see how these cookies crumble, because there's definitely a large contingent of people who are wanting rules like these for abortion. And now, for guns. So, Stephen, bring us home. What should the listeners take away?
Well, one of the very interesting things, I think, is to take away that comparison with other topics, and in particular, how the two different sides can be polar opposites. So all of a sudden, are you a champion of states' rights or are you a champion of the Constitution? It depends, doesn't it? Is it about reproductive rights or is it about gun rights? And you suddenly find yourself on opposite sides of the argument. So anybody who does find themselves on opposite sides of these two arguments should perhaps reconsider whether they are genuinely looking at the issues at stake or whether other things are actually colouring their views. HR 38 then may sound very simple, but it has these far-reaching implications. So if it were enacted, it would expand where individuals can legally carry concealed firearms. It would reduce variations between state laws, but it would shift authority away from states towards that federal government.
Okay, and like a lot of legislation we cover, the real story is not the title, it's the details.
As always.
That's all for today's episode of Beyond the Bill Number. If you want to track HR 38 or explore similar legislation,
and trust us, there's always more out there to explore.
Head on over to Bill Track 50, where you can follow bills in all 50 states and Congress in real time.
And we'll be back next time with another deep dive into the legislation shaping the country, one bill at a time. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment your opinions on what we spoke about today.
Until then, stay informed, aware, and think twice before you're crossing those state lines.